I'm ready. Okay.
This is Dr. Bernard Demczuk. I'm at the School Without Walls High School here at the GW campus, and today is December the 20th, 2011. And this is actually the library at the School Without Walls, where Miss Vollin is the librarian, and we're going to do our discussion here today in the library of the School Without Walls.
Okay.
So the class that I teach here is African American History and Culture. This class consists of 21 students, and they study particularly African American history and culture here at School Without Walls for the purpose of trying to understand the very rich and extensive and deep history that exists here in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. probably has the richest and deepest and most extensive black history in America. Black history in Washington, D.C. has gone all the way back to the 1740s, when earlier in that time, enslaved persons lived in Georgetown and Foggy Bottom and the Southwest waterfront. And in fact, African Americans back then cleared the land that created Washington, D.C. In fact, in the 1790s, African American enslaved persons cleared the mall, cleared the area where the Capitol is built, cleared the area where the White House is, cleared the area where the Washington Monument is. And in fact, slaves actually built the Washington Monument and the U.S. Capitol and the White House. And in fact, in the middle of the mall today was a canal, and that canal was drained by African American enslaved persons and filled in by their hard labor to create the mall today. So black people in Washington, D.C. go back 250 years, if not more. In fact, Georgetown and Foggy Bottom and Southwest waterfront were in fact slave tobacco ports. There were two products that they dealt with back then, and that was tobacco and slaves. So Washington, D.C. is built as a result of black labor and black talent and black aspirations. I think Washington, D.C. has probably the richest African American history in the country because of a lot of interesting things happening at the same time. Certainly there was a large black population here for so long. Starting in 1800, 25% of the 5,000 people who lived here in the beginning of the nation's capital were African American. Of that 25%, 80% were enslaved, which also means 20% were free. Now, if 20% were free, what did they do? They built churches, they built schools, they built businesses, and as they became more and more free, they freed other African Americans. So by 1830, D.C. was 50% free blacks, and by 1860, free blacks in D.C. was 90% of the black population.
Wow.
90% free in 1860, while slavery was still strong in Maryland and Virginia, and in the District of Columbia. In 1862, on April 16th, Emancipation Day occurred in Washington, D.C., and African Americans became free as a pilot program for the Emancipation Proclamation. And in fact, it worked. It worked because enslaved persons from Maryland and Virginia came across the line in 1862 and became free when they landed in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
They walked from Maryland and Virginia as runaway slaves. When they entered the city, they were free. And consequently, more and more African Americans began to come into Washington, D.C. And by the way, by the time you got 1870 and 1880, particularly with Howard University established here in 1867, you had almost a majority black Washington, D.C. So African Americans have been constantly attracted to Washington, D.C. As a result of that, enormously talented and significantly important African Americans lived here and grew up here. People like Langston Hughes and Carter G. Woodson and W. Du Bois and Allen Locke and Duke Ellington and Langston Hughes and John Toomer. These are African American luminaries who've been living in Washington, D.C. for a long, long time. So I think what we're trying to in part here at School Without Walls and throughout the whole DC school system is that black history is so rich and so deep and so extensive in DC. Why aren't we teaching it here? And what I certainly want to do is try to get our school system to understand how significant black history is here in Washington, D.C., and have all the schools teach black history like we do here at School Without Walls. I also think it's really important that as the city begins to change its demographics,